Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Mesosphere Conversation on Cities of Tomorrow podcast series. This time is not Cemeteries of Tomorrow, it's Cities of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Dr. Hamid Tavakoli, a landscape architect and researcher. And in this episode, we will have the honor to talk to David Worsley, founder and director, Worsley Consulting Engineers. As you know, Worsley Consulting for the first time proposed WC3, Australia's first purpose-built embodied carbon calculator for civil infrastructure. David will talk about the hidden carbon footprint of civil infrastructure and how engineers, planners, and landscape architects can start to see it, measure it, and design around it. With no further ado, we would start with the first question. Hi, David. Welcome to the program. To start, could you share a bit about your journey from a day job to founding your own already successful company? Also, what first drew you to civil engineering, public infrastructure, and which early experiences shaped how you see the world through engineering and trying to shape cities of tomorrow?
Yeah, thanks, Hamid. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here. Um, I think I'll go back to some early memories. One of the biggest influence for me has been my dad. So my dad had was quite a sciencey sort of guy. He was that way inclined. Like his brain worked really well in that space. He had graduate and postgraduate degrees in science matters. And so, yeah, I was exposed a lot to that growing up. He was also quite a techie guy, particularly when we're talking, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, using computers very, very early on. And so I was also exposed to computers really early on. And I think, those two components really shapes me. I think I inherited that mentality, that mindset and also those strengths, I guess, naturally being good in maths and science and physics and so on. Um, yeah. Uh, the other thing that I remember growing up as well was um, I was quite into computer games, and there was my favorite game was called SimCity. I don't know if you heard of SimCity.
No, unfortunately, I don't have
Oh,
any
it's
experiences yet.
okay. Well, yeah, obviously had different different childhoods, but yeah. So SimCity was a city builder, a city simulator.
Okay.
Now
SimCity.
it had four iterations between the 90s and the 2000s, and that got me really hooked on like urban design, planning, and civil engineering. And it got quite advanced in the 2000s with what was called SimCity 4, and in that you could modify the simulator, and I would try to modify and make it really accurate. So I was I think I was early double digits my age. No, I don't think I was even a teenager. But I remember looking up the standards in Australia for rail tracks and road grades, and
Wow.
and and I modified the software so that it would have those limitations, so it wouldn't be too steep. Um, so yeah, so that's just how my brain used to work back then, right? And hopefully still does work.
Amazing. That's amazing.
Um, yeah, and yeah, so I was always, that naturally inclined that way. And so when it came to going to uni, it was quite obvious that I was going to pick some sort of science or engineering degree. I decided engineering because I thought that would be most practical. It would give me the best job prospects, and civil engineering was, yeah, a pretty good place to start. Um, and after I graduated, I started in local government. So Wyndham Council was my local council,
Mm.
where I grew up in, and so I started there. I spent about 4 years in local government, not just in Wyndham, but other councils. And so, yeah, naturally, I was very much exposed to public infrastructure, the public sector, and seeing that side of things, where it's all about spending money and managing budgets in that way, getting value for money. And then I moved into the private sector. and that was in the moving to the consulting world.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I've been in the consulting world for now about 10 years
Right.
approximately, and working for Australian businesses, also working for global businesses like WSP and Meinhardt most recently. And as you say, just in the last year, I founded my own business. I got to the point where I thought um, I was ready, and I could make a difference, and I founded Worsley Consulting Engineers.
It's almost like a leap of faith for you to just quit your job and get
Mm.
into, yeah?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it takes a lot of courage, and obviously, yeah, you've got that courage as well, and yeah, it takes a lot of belief, and I think belief takes time. Oh, for me, it took quite a bit of time to do that. It took obviously lots of different experiences, lots of jobs, broadening that skill set, and yeah, getting to the point where I felt ready.
David, I know this is a bit off the tangent, but I want to ask you if people might be interested to start their own business. And as you mentioned clearly, it really needs courage and resistance and capability. What is your best recommendation to people who want to start their own business, quitting their job and start their own business? If you want to give them one
Yeah,
piece of advice.
make sure you got a business plan and you know exactly what you're setting out to achieve or what problem you're trying to solve. Really, that's the basis of the business plan. Um, yeah, because it's tough, right? Yeah, I'm sure, many people have heard the first year is extremely difficult, and many businesses fail in the first year as well. And I think it yeah really comes down to needing to um yeah have that plan and have a razor sharp focus on what you're gonna focus on. And that will direct your actions over that first year, and so yeah, so you've got a really clear mindset. I think that's really important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Just jump into the main body of questions about the topic and professional aspects of that. I've read through your documents and I can see that Worsley Engineering talks about moving from how to why. Can you talk about this a little bit? What does that actually look like in the ground? For example, you're working on a street or civic space or a memorial park. How you jump from how to why? What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So I might explain how that came about firstly. So the how to the why phrasing, that's a fundamental principle or a philosophy of my business, and it's derived from what I've created, I suppose, a theory of value creation in engineering, our value creation framework, and that's something that I guess, hypothesized and certainly developed over the maybe it's last 5 years or so, just at the back of my mind as I'm, doing my day job as a consulting engineer, and thinking, well, with some of the challenges that the engineering and the more generally the AEC industry is facing, how can we innovate? How can we be better, right? And the reason is that one of the most common words that I've heard over the last few years in engineering to describe it is that it's become a commodity. And when it becomes a commodity, that means that it's almost interchangeable. And you can swap in or swap out, any engineer for your project. You can plug and play basically,
Yeah.
and you expect to get the same outcome. So if that's the case, well then why would you not just get the cheapest one, right? Um, and if that's the case as well, that probably means that you don't think there is that much innovation, um, or they're not leaders or the innovators of the project. Um, it's also shown up in, for example, fees. So if you just do a benchmark of what the fees are for, say, a structural engineering fee on a building project, if you go back 30 years till now, the structural fees are half of what they used to be. Um, and why is that, right? That's the question I ask myself. And now there's many reasons to this, but I think one key part of it is um, engineers, we often focus too much on the how. We think that our sole role is to resolve a problem to undertake the how of resolving it. Um, but I think that particularly with AI now, for example, already engineering, as I say, is a commodity, but with AI and what's um, what's known as vibe engineering, um, the the value of just doing the how will continue to be devalued, right? Because you could just get an AI to do the
Exactly.
computations and that sort of thing, right?
Exactly.
So you've got to elevate your thinking. And so that's why I say we've got to move from how to why.
Fantastic.
Um,
Yeah.
and and when you say why, well, what does that mean? So it means understanding the contextual um, reasons or the purpose of the problem that you're trying to solve, right? It's expanding your thinking beyond just the technical standards. It's about taking leadership in projects, owning and understanding, what the strategic purpose is, what the ultimate outcome is, and that's also creates innovation. So I think, yeah, too often we jump into just the solving of how. We say for a typical civic 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 place project. We need on-site detention, we need a pit and pipe network, we need to design for the relevant design norms per Australian standards, right?
Yeah.
Um, but if if you consider, well, why do we do all these things, right? Yes, they're the standards, they're the local council standards or what. Um, but the bigger picture is we are trying to, or why are we doing it? The reason
Mhm.
is that we're trying to mitigate flooding. We're trying to manage water, right? Um, and with on-site detention, there's actually situations where, depending upon where a project is within a broader catchment, if you put on-site detention in, you actually increase flooding. Um, and so even if that's compliant to the standards from council, that is actually that's detrimental to the project outcomes. It's detrimental to the community outcomes. Um, and there's been a number of projects by applying this application in the last, look, I think over the last 4 years or so, where I've applied it in a couple of instances where we've been able to demonstrate to the council that actually, yeah, detention doesn't make
Mhm.
sense here. And so you take the detention out, you save the client a whole bunch of money, and at the same time, you actually improve the downstream hydraulics.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's one good example. But I guess more generally, it's about when we're collaborating with designers like yourself and others, it's about understanding the design intent, right? About the strategic purpose, about the overarching problem that's being solved. What's the purpose of that space? What are the accessibility requirements? What are the plants that have been selected? And how does that influence what the civil engineering needs to achieve?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. My understanding was that when you talk about how, you talking about the superficial surface understanding of the project, but when
Mm,
you move from how to why, then you start thinking about contextual components, as you mentioned, and then it just makes you to take the leadership of the program and have that strategic thinking and vision, so then we can holistically save the issue. Whereas in how looking sort of looking to the project, how then it could be more simplified and less holistic.
Yes, 100%.
Thank you so much. That's really very rich for people to absorb. That was really, really nice quote, and I really enjoyed that. Just moving to next question. Um, Worsley Consulting brings together civil engineering, traffic engineering, climate adaptation, generative or regenerative civil engineering, and I can see they've got a lots of overlaps with landscape architects. You got planners in the room, and you got the WC3 as well. How you manage to collaborate with this wide range of people in order to stick to your WC goals and objectives?
Um, yeah, well, I mean, yes, there's a lot that we do. I might just touch on firstly the climate and carbon to say that I really think that needs to be thought about a bit more. Um, I think that um, the biggest, one of the biggest themes, over the next number of decades involves these two things. But a lot of the times, the clients, or not necessarily end clients, but who we work with, they often just want to know, okay, what do you do with your civil and traffic, and focus on those advice, right? And there can be, yeah, there's so much more that you can add when you broaden your horizons, I suppose. So that's something that I would just encourage, when it comes to, I guess the crux of your question about, working with um, these these various stakeholders and parties. Just encourage them to expand, and you know consider taking some of these aspects on. You know, um, for example, when it comes to climate adaptation, there's studies that have shown that there's like a $11 return for every $1 that's spent on climate adaptation.
Mm.
So if you spend the money now on this, you're future-proofing the asset and you're protecting it from the inevitable effects of climate change, and the additional rehabilitation or reconstruction work that has to happen down the line, I think. Um, just a few other thoughts is I think that's um and where we can really, well, everyone really adds the most value and has the greatest influence is when you're as early as possible in a project, right? At the upfront business case feasibility master planning stage. And I think that there's a greater role that engineers could play in that. Often, the stakeholders you just mentioned, including the planners and the landscape architects and urban designers, um, they of course they take the leading role in the upfront work. But I think there's more that an engineer can do, and there's for a few reasons. I think that to be able to maximize the opportunities that are available at that time. If you get an engineer on board and get their input, then you're able to uh, prove, there's that technical proving of, some of the ideations and concepts that come out initially, right? Um,
David,
yeah,
before you continue, just
yeah.
jump into your quest discussion. So, what you mean is that you leading others. My understanding is that because you know the WC3 knowledge, you have that, then now you got a lot of stakeholders, you got a lot of consultants working with you as well as architects. Traditionally, architect has been the leader of the
Yeah.
project. But what you're saying now means that engineers in new era in 21st century, is that correct?
Look, I think it depends on it's project to project, I think. Yeah, it depends. In a diplomatic sense, I suppose. I think, in many, many instances, yeah, the architect, landscape architect, urban designer, They truly are the leaders. They're the visionaries. But I think that there's definitely a greater role that engineers can play. And there's a number of projects that I think of off the top of my head just in the last, I've been running the business little under a year, where we've ended up being the lead consultant. The engineer being the lead consultant is a bit unusual. But yeah, it just depends on those circumstances, I think. The last point I'll just make quickly, is I think when you get the engineers involved early on, it helps with there's an education piece. Um, you know, Bringing the engineers on the journey with the designers, the people who are the visionaries, you know, that that's yeah, by bringing the engineer along right from the start, they can better appreciate what are the strategic, purposes and objectives, right? Um, and hopefully that means that, you get flow-on effects where, as you move down the project life cycle, towards more detailed and more functional and technical design, that they will be there with you, supporting you and understanding, oh, this is what they're trying to do, so we shouldn't do this. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't support that, right? um yeah.
Yeah.
does, does that
So
make
it
sense?
looks like the role of engineer, as you mentioned earlier, if you look at the bill from civil engineers 20 years ago, but now you see this is double, triple. And I guess that's the leadership role that engineering now is taking over comparing to past. Because before, like a landscape architect could draw something, say, okay, do this for me, design this for me.
Yeah.
But now you got your saying at best as a good consultant to sort of designers and architects so that okay, this material that you use, this is not good, don't worry about it, or change this or change that, or let's have
Mm.
this approach. I guess there's
Yes.
more of the equal opportunities for
Yes.
engineers and architects
It's
to
all
work.
it's all about collaboration, right? So
Yeah,
yeah, I suppose it's not necessarily one, leading the other, but it's a genuine partnership. It's genuine collaboration where we're all equals. We've got different, personality, character traits, skill sets, and you combine them together and hopefully that gives you the best outcomes.
absolutely. Thank you so much. um I'm really interested. I'm sure that our audience also would be really interested in WC Carbon app, and I think that's a good time to just talk about that a little bit. As we discussed, you already invented this app. This is the first purpose-built embodied carbon calculator for infrastructure and covers A1 to A5 stages. For the people who are not professional in, if you want to explain this for somebody who is not a
Yeah.
professional in civil infrastructure, could you please give us some examples of how does that work and how this actually help our streetscapes, parks, civil landscapes to be better and have less embodied carbon?
Yeah. Thanks, Ahmed. So WC3, firstly, if I tell a bit of the backstory, WC3 is an idea that I've had for, again, a few years. Um, and I think being able to, um, while working for myself, being able to, prioritize things, in my own way, it gave me the opportunity, it gave me the time to focus on development of this app. And the reason is that, as you say, as far as I'm aware, and I've spoken to many, industry bodies and leaders, in this space, it is Australia's first purpose-built, for embodied carbon with, civil or ground plane infrastructure. So, of course, landscape projects are very much included. And so there's been a capability gap. And what I like to say at times is that, we're democratizing carbon analysis. So we're making it accessible to an audience that typically it wasn't accessible to. And that's including the civil engineers, that's including landscape architects, right? Uh, Historically, you know, embodied carbon is quite a specialist um, design element, I suppose, or reporting element, and it's generally been the domain of sustainability consultants or specialists. But what I've the vision I guess that I've had is that this app will allow lots of other different types of stakeholders to be involved in that process and to through a simple, easy to understand, user interface and processes to be able to become part of that discussion. Um, and so, when more people are involved and understand this, then hopefully that means that more people can appreciate its importance. And, we put it on the agenda for clients and for consultants more generally, right? So that's the holistic thing. Um, Now, initially it was developed, it was developed internally as a tool for our chartered engineers, um, and we saw it as a value, I guess, a differentiation, of our services is that we can design, we'll do the civil and traffic design for you, but we'll also measure the embodied carbon footprint of that as well and show you where it can improve. But then quickly I got interest from external parties, and they're like, "Well, would you be interested in, creating or commercializing it, making, creating licenses that we can get access to?" Because others, yeah, have recognized that it's not something that has that capability has never really been around. There's lots and lots of tools for embodied carbon, but they're all focused on buildings, particularly in Australia. So yeah, so that's I guess the background of it. Now, um, what we're seeing is that it's look, it's still early days, is what I'd say. So we commercialized it and we released it late last year. So it's generally been an internal tool for the first 6 months. We've had a lot of testing internally, and we've had clients provide feedback and so on. So that's refined it to the point where we've taken it external. But that's the whole idea behind the app. Now, when I say A1 to, or when you said A1 to A5, what does that mean? So that relates to and focuses on upfront embodied carbon. So that's relating to everything from getting materials extracted from out of the ground, processing it, taking it to site, manufacturing, of course, and then taking it to site and building it. So that's what the upfront component of a embodied carbon life cycle is. There's also a use stage, which is module D, and there's also C, which is the end of life demolition as well. And I will actually I'll just put it out there that we are developing those modules, and watch this space. We're looking at releasing it in the next couple of months or so. And that would give you a full life cycle assessment of embodied carbon. Now, why should we care about it? Well, there's many, many decarbonisation targets that have been set at all levels of government and all levels of industry. So, yeah, the Australian government has the 2035 decarbonisation target. They're targeting 62 to 70% reduction in embodied carbon by 2035. Victorian government and other state governments, they've got decarbonisation or net zero even targets by whether it's 2040, 2045, or 2050. Those are all the common dates. Um, and then at the local government level, there's lots of what are called climate emergency plans or decarbonisation plans, and it's them responding to what they see is a crisis, and it's something that requires urgent attention, and they're pledging to achieve whether it's net zero or an X percentage reduction in carbon. But these are great aspirations and targets, but the pathway to achieving that is not clear, and a big part of that is because until well, even now, there hasn't been enough investment in in well in how it's going to be achieved. So there's a lot of focus at the moment on what's called operational carbon, and that's relating to primarily energy emissions. So for a building, for example, the operational carbon is, when it's operating, people are using it. It's using electricity, might be using gas, etc. Um, and that's the operational footprint. But in the next 5 to 10 years, um, there's studies done by universities, including University of Melbourne, that says that embodied carbon, which is so operational is one thing. Every other piece of carbon emission associated with a product or an asset is embodied carbon. Um, and that's going to be the predominant emission source for Australia and for industry. So the attention is going to need to turn to how do we firstly measure the embodied carbon of our projects, and then secondly, that will give you a baseline and a pathway to work out, well, how do we reduce it to actually achieve these objectives?
David, a question like I don't know much about it. Let's say I'm a landscape architect who want to design something. I'll give you the design, and you develop a sort of scenario modeling for that design. Is that correct? My understanding is correct. And then you get back to me with the revised material palette. Is that correct?
Oh, look, it can be used. So think of it as a tool that enables um, and develops your understanding of embodied carbon. So you can use it in different ways, right? So firstly, the most obvious is that say we come up with a master plan or a concept design, um, and we input the design into the calculator. And so there's two ways you can do that. One is that you can import a model at the moment from civil site design. So we've collaborated with Australia's second largest civil design software package. So there's a direct integration from civil site design.
Wow.
So you just click a button there, it imports and all the data's there, and it gives you a number straight away. Or secondly, you go through sort of like a bill of quantities, right? So you'll have pavements, you'll have edging such as, whether it's steel edge or whether it's concrete edging, curbs, that sort of thing. Um, and yeah, whether it's pits and other things, you'll have in a civic project, you might have different street furniture and retaining walls and that sort of thing, right? And you just plug away at that, and it builds up a calculation of the embodied carbon of that project. And so you can start with, okay, so that's your baseline. Um, and the app, we have an AI, a built-in AI feature where it analyzes, it gives you a executive summary of your carbon footprint, as
Mm.
well as suggestions on how you can reduce your embodied carbon. And you can start from there to see, okay, so say we've got 30% of our carbon footprint is from the shared path. So what can we do with the
Mhm.
shared path to reduce embodied carbon? It might be changed to material. It might be it might be even just redesigning the shared path. Maybe instead of a 3 meter shared path, it's a 2.5 shared path, for example.
Mhm.
Um, or maybe it's combining. Maybe instead of having separate vehicle and pedestrian, you might for a short section. Maybe it's a true shared zone where it's yeah, it's pedestrian, cyclists, and low speed vehicles if that's an appropriate environment, right? The first step is measurement and baselining, and from there, that opens up all the opportunities because now you're enabled, you have information. Before, we've got all these aspirations, but we're not able to actually do much with it because we don't understand. Okay, where do we start? The
Mhm.
first, the starting point is knowing what the carbon footprint is, and then you're able to get guided from there. So yeah, to answer your question, start with the measurement and baselining. I'd recommend, and then you can in the app you can look at different scenarios. So you can say, okay, what if we did this to the shed path, or what if we did this and we change the concrete edging to maybe bluestone edging, for example. Or, what if we tweak the levels so we reduce the earthworks? You can play around with all these different things and compare, the carbon footprint of all these different options.
All right. And that's the place that the architectural design and engineering rich and interact directly. Exactly. Yeah, that's
Exactly.
really,
Yeah, so it takes collaboration.
yeah. Thank you so much. Just going through that app and scenario modeling, what tends to surprise the teams? Which material or which specific or feature surprise in order to have particularly the most carbon embodied energy, the maximum carbon embodied energy comparing to other material?
So the first thing that comes to mind that really stood out for a client, um, which I think is a nice example because it's you're close to these clients as well, is in cemeteries. So there was a project that we worked on over the last 6 months or so.
So yeah, my question was that what was the shocking material that you've seen for
Yeah,
this year at?
yeah. So what comes to mind is over the last 6 months or so, we've been working on a cemetery project, and we're doing master planning, concept design, and feasibility work. And what we discovered um, was now we did this as a value add. We said we'll do a pro bono assessment of your embodied carbon because we know that you've got decarbonisation targets. Let's see how it stacks up. Um, and 50% of the upfront carbon was the grave foundations.
Wow,
Yeah,
50%.
50%. Um, and yeah, like all of us were
This
we were
indeed shocking.
we
Yeah,
were definitely surprised. All of
yeah.
us were surprised in the room. Yeah, we had the same reaction. The client had the same reaction as you now.
Wow,
And yeah, so now we know exactly where we need to focus on, don't we?
exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
And if you think about it another way, what are grey foundations? They're a bunch of steel and a bunch of concrete.
yeah.
So
It's a very
that
good
that is
question.
very carbon intensive. Um,
Absolutely.
and depending on the product as well, if it's monumentals that are big heavy duty foundations, then of course, yeah, it'll have a huge footprint. But even just lawn beams still have a very large footprint. So yeah, that was probably the number one that comes to
Yeah,
mind.
thank you.
But also, yeah, earthworks and pavements are typically are large components as well. Earthworks is a huge amount. Like if you're moving dirt from one part of the site to another, or you're importing the earthworks from another site, that's a lot as well. So being able to manage your soil really well, limiting unnecessary earthworks, yeah, that'll make a big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Indeed, concrete is the worst enemy of sustainable design.
It
I'm not
is.
sure
It
what.
is.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. That was very informative and giving us insight about specifically talking about designers, really help designers to understand. And I really appreciate the WC3 functionality and benefits. Um, just going through to your publications, I just realized that you got two phrases. You distinguish between climate sensitive
Mm.
design and regenerative civil design. Can you explain that for a simple person like me?
Yeah. So these two phrases, they they're aligned to our thinking of the why, moving beyond just the how of your standard, your standard drawings or your technical standards. Now, climate sensitive design is a recognition, firstly, of the importance, as I've mentioned before, the importance of understanding um, uh, well, there's two things when it comes to the climate. Firstly is climate change adaptation, and there's also climate mitigation as well. Now, climate change mitigation, a lot of that we've just talked about, which is, in other words, it's decarbonisation. You know, um, by reducing our global emissions profile, the ultimate goal is to manage our mean temperature increases.
Mhm.
Um, and the Paris Agreement is 1.5 to 2 degrees increase is what we're trying to achieve, and no more than that. So that's what that's about. But really, yeah, it's a term that I haven't seen used too much, but that's really what the intent is understanding that it's ingrained in our thinking and our design methodology that we are aware of the importance of the climate, and as the name suggests, we're sensitive to it in the design decisions that we make. So, we're always trying to reduce the embodied carbon where we can, but we're also cognizant of the fact that the climate is changing. And so we're not just designing to the current technical standards, we're also considering the climate projections. And we're making a judgment call on what emissions pathway do we think is appropriate, right? Well, that's an engineering judgment we've got to make. And obviously there's a lot of science that's behind that. But that often means that, well, we've got to consider when we're doing, say, a water balance model, that the availability of water in the future is going to be less than what it is now. So over a year, there'll be less rainfall. Even if there's in individual rain events, you might have flash flooding that's 10 or 15% or 20% higher than what it is now, but you'll have less of that over a year. So there's more likelihood of droughts, for example, and less availability of water for harvesting and obviously for plants. And so that needs to be considered as well. Now, regenerative civil design. This is, I would say, it's almost a subset of climate sensitive design, but it's a design approach that's been pioneered by my colleague is Rick DePaula, um, and he he was inspired in turn by regenerative agricultural practices. But the idea behind regenerative civil design is we are trying to align our the way that we manage land and water with pre-settlement approaches and systems. So, in other words, um, the way that we have traditionally designed civil infrastructure in Australia is imported from during colonial times. You know,
Yeah.
now Australia and Britain have quite different climates. Um, but what we do in Australia, and of course, climates and soil profiles and hydrology differences, ecology differences. But despite that, we've taken an approach of typically try to drain a surface as quickly and efficiently as possible, concentrate it, typically through pipes or swales, and treat it at an end of line location, which might be a detention basin or an underground tank or something like that, and send it out to what we call in Victoria the legal point of discharge. Um, but if you think about what were the pre-settlement characteristics, the way water was managed was quite different. The way waterways looked was quite different. So, I might give one great example. Um, so we're working at the moment on a cemetery master plan. It's quite a large one. In Victoria, and it has a creek that runs through it. Now that creek and the land at the moment is used for agriculture. It's quite degraded,
Hmm.
So this creek is a creek in name only. It's very, very rarely flows. It has very steep banks caused by, erosion over time due to the development upstream, that's changed the hydraulic characteristics or hydrology characteristics. Um, and what we're looking at doing is reactivating and regenerating the creek. So returning it to what it looked like in pre-settlement. And that means that it would be shallower. Um, we're trying to look at how we can reintroduce billabongs and gilgais. Um, and that's through a different approach to managing water on site. So instead of thinking water is a problem and needs to be drained away, water is a resource. And we try to retain the water on site as much as possible. We try to get the moisture into the ground. We try to slow the water, limit it from exiting site by putting in elements like uh, leaky weirs, for example, or contour berms, where water is able to settle into the soil, um, and green it up over time, establish a changing microclimate, a greening. Um, so yeah, it's quite a different thinking to traditional civil engineering and stormwater management.
Yeah, so none of them are inferior. They talk to each other. Is that correct, my understanding? Or you got one of them, like the generative or regenerative civil design is overarching to climate sensitive design. Is
Oh,
that?
I think climate sensitive design is, I think that's more holistic in that,
Yep.
yeah, we recognize that as um, one of the key themes that needs to be considered in any design, right? It must
Yeah.
be one of the key outcomes.
Yeah.
And there's many components to that. As I say, there's the adaptation, there's the mitigation, um, and regenerative civil design sort of sits under that, in that it responds to the adaptation requirement. Um, so it's trying to uh, create an environment that is able to withstand the changing climate. Um, we're trying to provide more water for plants, for example. We're able to reduce heat island effects as well, for example, through that approach of keeping moisture in the ground. But it also actually reduces embodied carbon as well, because a lot of the times the designs that we're coming up with, they have a lot less hard, high carbon materials. So there's a lot less concrete, in other words, as well as other materials.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think again, getting back to your previous discussion, water sensitive urban design that you're doing makes you an urban designer. So the boundaries between the design and engineering, in my eyes, with your descriptions, is are really blurred because they already merge together. You're already thinking about you put on your ecological understanding hat, so you become an ecologist to look into the environment that you're going to provide that water sensitive urban design so that you would be thinking holistically through the whole environment, I think. Yeah, thank you
Mm,
so much. Um, I'm mindful of time. I've got a couple of more questions if you don't mind. I'll
mm.
go through that. We covered a lot of discussions about stakeholders and understanding the knowledge of embodied carbon energy. Um, at this point, I would like to go through that sort of administrative processes. It starts from procurement, scoping, governance, design, and construction. How we can improve the quality of embodied carbon in a project utilizing or leveraging procurement or scoping or design or construction. Is it only about the construction, or we can manipulate or let's say improve the quality of those other components to achieve a better sort of low embodied carbon environment?
So what what I think is important to understand is the legislation, the environment in which embodied carbon, or I should say more generally, decarbonisation targets have been set. So there is in one way, there's a lack of adequate legislation and mandates. So if we think about right from the top, I mentioned earlier a whole bunch of decarbonisation targets. They're aspirational. Um, the action plans, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, but um, a key technical point is that these targets generally focus on what's called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So Scope 1 is the direct emissions caused by the entity that's being measured.
Yep.
Scope 2 is the energy that is bought or used by that entity. Um, and Scope 3 is everything else. So a lot of what we've talked about when it comes to embodied carbon relating to a capital works project, a construction project, whether it's a road and streetscape or it's a parkland or cemetery, the emissions generally are in the Scope 3 bucket. And so right now, it's not mandated, um,
Mm.
and most targets, as I say, are not focused
Yeah.
on Scope 3. And again, I think a big part of that is um, there's one of the big results of that is that there's this focus, again, said before, about operational carbon instead of embodied carbon. Now, operational carbon has the bigger footprint and influence at the moment. So, of course, that's the area that people are trying to solve right now. But it's also, I think, if I could say, it's low-hanging fruit. You know, how do you get to net zero when it comes to operational carbon? Just to electrify the grid.
Mhm.
It's almost as simple as that. Now, of course, there's things in transport in particular, which are much more challenging. Electrification of every piece of transport is a real challenge, and it may not be practical. So there's definitely some big challenges there, but by far um, electrification of the grid goes a very, very long way in that respect.
Mhm.
Um, and so, as everyone's moving along the electrification of the grid journey across Australia and globally, very, very quickly the emissions profile the balance is changing from operational to embodied. And so, as I say, over the next 5 years or so, it's forecasted that embodied carbon is going to be the biggest impact. It's going to be the biggest source of emissions. So if we're going to be achieving our aspirations, we've got to get serious about Scope 3 sooner rather than later. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's really the biggest focus needs to be, if we're talking at the big picture, is in legislation. Setting up frameworks and laws that talk about Scope 3 and having that cascade down, to
Mhm.
different levels of organizations or different levels of government and industry, and ultimately into action plans. Um, yeah, so that is the biggest change. But I also think that sooner rather than later, um, uh, people will need to come back to this, and even if it's not mandated yet in Australia, in many other jurisdictions it is or it will be. And so, we're going to have to move with the global movement as well. Over the next 30, 40 years, I think climate change and decarbonisation is the single largest, mega trend or theme. Um, and so, there's ebbs and flows. It had a really good run the last few years, but now there's wars, there's cost of living, with inflation and those sorts of things. But they come and go to a degree. But over the long term, that will be the single biggest thing that influences the next generations and so on. And so it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And so I think everyone's going to shortly need to to take it seriously. Scope 3 and embody carbon.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, that's very crucial component which is oversighted at the moment with you know, lack of supervision and directions from the procurement. Indeed, that is really beneficial for our audience, I guess. Um, I've got a couple of more questions, but I think it would be quick. Your firm directs 1% of every WC3 to a Stripe Climate's carbon removal portfolio. What does that mean and how this could be beneficial for the communities?
Yeah, so the Stripe climate commitment. So what that means is that if someone is signs up and uses our app, straight away 1% of all of the sales revenue is funded directly to Stripe Climate. Now, Stripe Climate is one of the largest um, organizations or or funding bodies, I suppose, for carbon removal globally. And it funds thousands and thousands. Like you can
Mhm.
just Google it. There's a big database of all the different projects and programs um, and companies that it supports. But they're all focused on carbon removal. So it's a bit different to what we've been talking about. In that we're focused on more designing it out um, um, yeah, and taking emissions out of what's being built in future. But carbon removal is literally extraction, taking
Mhm.
carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it, for example, sequestration into the ground and things like that. Um, so yeah, so it's I guess the other half of or the other component that's going to be really important to achieving these global ambitions and targets.
Uh, Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. I would like to ask my last question and I'll let you go. The question is that if you want to give, you are directly dealing with city council, cemetery trust, and other sort of public organizations. If you want to give a strategic planner or a manager in one of these organization a piece of advice about the design, planning, construction, I know that you already got the WC3 and they can use that, but what would be the piece of advice that you're giving to these people in order to have that green sort of design or construction or operation in place?
Oh, look, I might be repeating myself to a degree, but yeah, I think we have touched on it. I really think that as well, in industry and globally, it's going to become mandatory to look at your
Mhm.
scope 3 and tackling embodied carbon. So, yeah, moving from operational to embodied carbon, it's going to be the number one source soon. So you've got to get serious about it. I think you've just got to reflect on, your existing organizational strategic plans and goals, and how can you cascade that down through action plans, and I suppose ultimately to where we sit, which is on projects. How do you filter that down and ensure that that is part of your project goals, and how do you measure that? There's I'm sure there's lots of work that's already being done in that space, and there's lots more work that needs to be done. But um, I think it's yeah, I think that's obviously I think it's very, very important. I think it's the number one theme, as I say, for the next number of decades.
All right, thank you so much, David, for your time and fantastic sort of discussion. You're so knowledgeable. I really learned a lot from this session, and I hope that our audience also enjoyed the program. Thank you so much, and we catch you hopefully next time in another episode.
Yeah, I hope so, Hamid. It's been great. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Cheers.